Yesterday, we had the opportunity to learn about the Bodhisattva's journey for a very long time on the path of cultivating the paramitas. Having finally cultivated the various transcendent ways, he was born into the Tushita heaven, the heaven of contentment, where he lived for a long time as he looked down on this world and waited for appropriate conditions to arise for his final birth. When he saw that those conditions had arisen, which happened to be in India 2,500 years ago, he passed away from his position as the god Swetaketu in that particular heaven, and entered the womb of Queen Mahamaya in the city of Kapilavastu in what is now Nepal. He was in her womb for exactly 10 months. And at that time, she realized that birth was coming. She suddenly felt the determination to return to her parents and give birth at her home with them, which wasn't unusual at the time, but she entered labor on the way. And she left the chariot and gave birth holding onto a tree. Trees, as you may notice, are very important in the Buddhist tradition, and we proudly continue to include trees in our own tradition, adding maple trees to this glorious lineage. She was holding on to a tree as she gave birth, which is actually often considered to be a more natural way to give birth than the way people often do it nowadays in hospitals. And upon giving birth, the gods poured down in celebration warm and cool water. Warm rain fell to wash them off. Cool rain fell to wash them and cool them down, but then it was a little too cold, so warm rain came again, washed them, and then a little too hot, so cold rain came, cooled them again. And the infant Bodhisattva then stood up right then and there and walked around in 10 steps in a circle and pointed one hand up and one hand down and said, "In all of heaven and earth, I am supreme." It was very nice. And then returned to his mother. Now, this is a very, very good story, and we celebrate it in Buddhist monasteries by in the springtime. We go out into the woods, into the mountains, and we collect as many flowers as we can. In Japan, we collect so many flowers. We collect armfuls of flowers, and we carry them down from the mountain, and then we spread them over. We make it a wonderful array, floral array over the altar. And spend all day on this. It's very, very fun. And then we have a bowl of clear water and another bowl which has a little statue of the infant Buddha infant Bodhisattva standing there with his hands up and down and crying out, "In all of heaven and earth, I am supreme." And then we go and we take a ladle and we pour water on him, just like the gods did to wash him. One of those nice bamboo ladles. Very easy to make a ladle with bamboo. One branch, and you just cut it. You have a ladle. And we pour the water. It's very fun. Everybody's chanting. It's one of the most enjoyable ceremonies of the year. Now, of course, we can look at this from the perspective of exaltation, that we exalt this incredible being who spent 300 aeons and 20 incalculably long periods to enter this, his final birth. Realize complete awakening. Incredible. We have to say it's extraordinary. And so, of course, if you had moved through such a long period of difficulty, one would think that one would be able to, at the very least, take 10 steps, point up and down, and say, in all of heaven and earth, I am supreme. But, of course, nowadays we don't appreciate this interpretation so much. So we'll skip over this fantastic interpretation to one that we may not be ready for yet, but it's one that we might be more comfortable with. And that is the mystical interpretation, which is simply that we all have the Buddha nature. All of us at birth move into each of the directions. All of the directions. We move north, northeast, east, all the way around in these 8 or 7.5 steps, and then 2 more up and down with our arms. So in every direction, we expand. Our energy, our presence, our place in the world expands throughout the universe, and then we cry out with absolute confidence that this is where I am supposed to be. I am the center of the entire world. Let's cry, claiming, I have no shame. I am the center of everything, and you should treat me as such. Right? Is that not what it's like? Okay. Yes. These babies cry out in that way. With no concern, no sense. I'm not good enough. I ought to be different. These circumstances ought to be different. Baby expecting to be treated like the center of the world. As today, we had some guests, and one of them was a baby. And it's amazing. It's like you can't help but treat them like they're the center of the world. Partially because they just expect it, but partially because there's something so magical and beautiful there. It really does seem to be perfect. Amazing. And that hasn't gotten covered over yet. Of course, babies have these underlying tendencies. And these underlying tendencies are what this practice purifies. Babies invariably become deeply deluded, self-centered. This self-centeredness is not the same as an understanding that we are truly at the center of the world. It's not like that. We just become selfish. And we cut through that. But at first, there's already a magnificent awareness. The baby's born, and that awareness already immediately, miraculously expands. And we can't help but see it. We see them as beautiful, as astonishing. And oftentimes, the people who are there, such as the mother, continues to see that for that individual's entire life, even though there are a lot of other things that we might see as well. Right? So, this interpretation is helpful for us because we can see that we also, when we were born, we took 8 steps. We immediately stood up and took 8 steps and pointed our hands in the 2 directions, up and down, and cried out, "In all of heaven and earth, I am supreme." With that first pure cry. We do this training so that we can cry out like that once again. That's the significance of this training. We come here so that we can cry like that again. Having done this, of course, you could say the underlying tendencies needed to hold sway. And so the Bodhisattva grew up. And he grew up as a prince, which basically meant as a warrior. Soon after his birth, sadly, his mother, Queen Mahamaya, passed away, and he was raised by his aunt, I never pronounced this correctly. Mahapajapati Gautami. She was his wet nurse, and for all intents and purposes, his mother. She was the person who he knew as his mother. And he learned the arts that a prince would need to learn at that time. He learned swordplay, archery. He learned the customs, the law of the land. He grew up, entered puberty, and soon thereafter, when he was 16, married the magnificent Yashodhara, and grew into adulthood, and when they were 28, she gave birth to their son, Rahula. And soon thereafter, the Bodhisattva realized, it's time now for me to see the world. It suddenly occurred to him, I need to see this kingdom that I'm going to inherit. I've spent my whole life sheltered by this palace. I don't know enough about this world. He looked back over his life. He considered, what have I really done with my life? I spent some time in my hot season palace, summer palace, where there are wonderful pools to bathe in with hundreds of attendants, musicians, entertainers, all female, for his pleasure. Wonderful place. I spent 4 months of the year also in my rainy season palace, which was covered over, dry, with hundreds of attendants, all female, and sometimes in my cold season palace, which is made to be warm, with hundreds of attendants, all female. It's been great, but I haven't really seen much. And he looked back over his life and he wondered, what have I really seen in my life after all? Looked back, and the only thing he could really remember was that when he was 6 years old, he was at a plowing ceremony, which his father had led to initiate the agricultural season. And at that time, he watched his father till the land with a ceremonial plow. And he noticed that birds came down. and settled behind the plow. And he wondered, what's happening? We had another child here, about 4. And those of you who have been with 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, know they're very curious. We tried to walk from the cabin that I live in down the driveway at a normal pace. Well, she was having none of it. There's an interesting triangular stick here. We need to spend a lot of time on this stick. And I think this is a footprint. I'm pretty sure it's a white footprint. Yes, it is a white footprint. And nothing we could say to dissuade her from that view. And besides, we wanted to move on. But soon enough, this is a flat rock. Here it is. This rock is flat. You see? You see? You see? You see? So this 6-year-old boy was very interested in all kinds of things, just like 6-year-olds typically are. And he noticed these birds coming down. He wondered, why are they coming down? And he saw them settling down on the field. He saw them pecking around in the soil. He looked closely. He was up on a hilltop overlooking the field under a rose apple tree, and he wondered what they were doing. And he suddenly realized, to his horror, that they were pulling the grubs out of the soil and eating them. He thought, oh no, this is terrible. This has to be stopped. All of the food we eat is based on this terrible suffering of those cute, nice grubs. Those grubs were there peacefully living their lives, and we've destroyed their homes. And now they're dying so that we can have food. Oh no. We can't live this way. We should experience this kind of horror as well, especially if we're going to do things like develop this land and put a village in and put zendos in and everything. We have to feel that same pain of destroying living beings' homes. We have to take that very seriously. We can't be callous and self-centered about it. We have to be caring and aware of the damage that we're doing and make a decision from that place. So he was very concerned, and he didn't know what to do. And so right there, as a 6-year-old, just a kid, just a child, who had received no spiritual instruction of any kind whatsoever from anyone, he entered samadhi. He just entered samadhi. He extracted his mind from the mind that is destroying the world. Consider that even then, there had already been a terrible destruction of life through human beings. And he found a way out of it, found a way beyond it. And he experienced what's called the first jhana, a rapturous state of deep concentration. And he remained in that state for a few hours. And his father finished the ceremony and came up the hill where his attendants were still, where the Bodhisattva's attendants were still looking over him as he sat under the tree. And his father suddenly realized that the shadow of the rose apple tree that was on him, shielding him from the hot sun, hadn't moved at all, even though all of the other shadows of the other trees had moved as the sun moved across the sky. And he couldn't help but bow down before his son. But at that time, he became very concerned that his son might continue to meditate and eventually become a monk and leave and not become a king. He wanted his son to be a king. He wanted his son to have power. He didn't want his son to be taken away, live some weird lifestyle, some ascetic life. And so he tried to shield his son from any further awareness of suffering. This is just like us. We live in the same world. We're sheltered. We're shielded from the terrible suffering of the world. Why? Because if we weren't, well, then we would realize the importance of entering samadhi, just like this little child did. And the Bodhisattva realized there, at the age of 28, realized, I haven't really seen much. I've just been in these nice palaces surrounded by pleasure for a long time. I need to see a little bit more if I'm going to rule this land someday. And so he asked his charioteer to take him out into the city of Kapilavastu. And so they went out, and he saw the wonderful streets, which had been cleaned up for his viewing pleasure. He thought, wow, what a wonderful city. Everyone seems happy. Everyone seems healthy. This is so fun. I like this city. This is great. Wow, look at all these wonderful merchants selling their wares, friends chatting happily. This is fantastic. Again, this is the world that we try to create. And as they went through the streets, eventually he saw something that he hadn't seen before, something he had never seen before. He saw a person whose face seemed discolored, who was vomiting, who was struggling for breath. Looked like they were in terrible pain. And he asked his charioteer, what sort of a person is that? What's happening with that person? And his charioteer said, this is a sick person. And the Bodhisattva said, a sick person? What do you mean a sick person? What is a sick person? It's a person who's sick and ill, who's lost their health, who's suffering, whose body is failing them. The Bodhisattva was horrified at this. He said, well, this isn't good at all. We shouldn't have this here in Kapilavastu. We should get rid of it. We shouldn't have sickness here. I don't like it. We need to get rid of it. Yes. And the charioteer said, we don't have that power. We can't get rid of illness. I said, what? So people just keep on getting sick? Not just this person? I said, that's right. Many people are sick right now. And suddenly the Bodhisattva had to ask a question that had never occurred to him before. And he said, but could I get sick? The charioteer said, yes, certainly you could get sick. And suddenly, all of the happiness, all of the enjoyment of the day fell away. And he said, we need to turn back. We need to go back to the palace. I don't like this anymore. I'm not enjoying this anymore. This is no good. We need to go back now. You bring us back now. Now, some of us here might be a little bit familiar with this tone of voice and state of mind, because some of us here might experience this tone of voice and this state of mind even in this retreat. Yes. We might find ourselves returning to being a teenager, a child, a toddler, as the reality of suffering descends on our minds. We might say, I don't like this anymore. I don't like this retreat. I want to go back. You bring me back right now. This is no good. I don't feel good anymore. We've been sheltered. We've been confused by this world. Has tried to prevent us from understanding that there's such a thing as sickness. Again and again, people who get sick, you hear it say, even though they decided they would never say this, they say it anyway. I never thought it would happen to me. I just somehow didn't think it would happen to me. Cancer is something that happens to those other people. But there comes a day when we realize that we also are subject to sickness. Well, they went back, but the next day the Bodhisattva couldn't help it. He wanted to go back out into the city again. So they went back out into the city. And he started seeing the interesting sights and sounds of the city and feeling like, you know what? Maybe sickness isn't so bad after all. Probably sickness is just something that happens sometimes to some people. Probably won't happen to me for a long time anyway. It's probably nothing to worry about. Okay, I feel better. Okay, he saw some street performers. That was fun. Saw some music. It seemed fun. Okay, this is a pretty good city after all. Okay, it's not so bad. Okay, let's calm down. Got to talk ourselves through this here. It's going to be okay. No problem. And then suddenly, to his horror, he saw a person stooped over with broken teeth, wobbling legs, with a cane, unable to see or hear well, with dementia, unable to understand where they were going, trying to find their way back home. And the Bodhisattva turned to his charioteer and said, "What sort of a person is that? That doesn't look good at all." And his charioteer said, "That is an old person." "An old person?" He said, "Yes, that is an old person." "Well, what is an old person?" An old person is someone who's moved through the prime of their life, which you're now in. You're now as strong, as healthy as you'll ever be. From now on, now that you're 28, you're going to become weaker from now on. Gradually, people become old, just like that. They lose their faculties, they even lose control of their bodies, and they're subject to the care of others, which others may or may not give them. They become confused. Generally, they become deeply lonely. And the joy, the excitement of life falls away. "What?" the Bodhisattva said. "And you're telling me that this happens to lots of people, and this will happen to me also?" Charioteer said, "Well, if you're lucky, it'll happen to you." "What?" And once again, he entered this place that none of us want to enter. We come to a retreat like this not because we want to enter this state of mind. Oh no, absolutely not. We come to retreat so we can experience peace and gentle happiness with clouds floating past. We don't want this confusion and despair facing reality. So he said, "Turn around, turn the chariot around. We need to go back. Go back to the palace right now." "I don't like this. I'm not happy. Make it go away." And so they went back. But the next day he couldn't help it, so they left again and went into the city. And nothing looked that good anymore. Everything looked sort of gray and meaningless. But he saw people doing this and that until finally he saw something he had never dreamed of. He saw a person lying totally still on a bier carried by 6 family members. They were all crying and wailing. But that person just wouldn't move, and they were walking in the direction of the charnel ground. And the Bodhisattva turned to his charioteer and said, "What is wrong with that person? What's happening with that person? Why don't they get up and comfort their family and tell them it's all going to be okay?" People have always told me it's all going to be okay. Don't you think it's all going to be okay? Why doesn't he get up and tell them it's all going to be okay? They seem really sad. I don't think it's good that people are sad. I hope that they feel better. So why doesn't that person tell them that they should feel better? And as charioteer said, that person is never going to get up again. That person has died. The Bodhisattva couldn't help but remember what he'd learned about the sick person and the old person. And in seeing that someone in the world could die, he couldn't help but then ask, "And do others also die?" And his charioteer said, "Yes. Everyone dies." And at that moment, it was as if the whole world caved in for Siddhartha Gautama, the Bodhisattva. As if the entire world caved in, was obliterated and destroyed. Everything seemed meaningless. There didn't seem to be any escape in any direction from this horror that had entered his heart. And he asked, "And so I also will die?" And his charioteer said, "Yes. It's not certain that you will become sick, and it's not certain that you'll become old. But it is certain that you will die. You cannot escape it." Everything the Bodhisattva had done for his entire life seemed meaningless, worthless, inconsequential. Because he realized that no matter what he did, he was always walking in the same direction, always walking towards death. Every direction led to the one single destination. And that destination was, to him, completely unacceptable. And so, he told the charioteer, "Turn around. Go back to the palace." But on their way back, they happened upon another person, a mendicant, a bhikkhu, a person who had given up sensual pleasures, who had extracted themselves from this world, and had dedicated themselves totally to the resolution of suffering, to the complete understanding of suffering, to the complete understanding of the great matter of birth and death. And into that terrible horror came a bit of light, a bit of hope. And the Bodhisattva realized what he needed to do. He needed to do exactly the same thing as that individual had done. He needed to dedicate himself completely to the resolution of suffering, to the complete understanding of birth and death. So they got back to the palace, and he found it very difficult to do what needed to be done. He didn't want to leave his wife. He didn't want to leave his son. This is taken in the story to be the hardest thing he ever did, to leave them. He loved them so much. It's not like nowadays where we've entered such a derelict world, such a corrupt world, that we hear this story of the Bodhisattva leaving his wife, his child, his father, and his mother, and we think he was just running away or something like that. He didn't want to leave them at all. And if we interpret it that way, it says a lot more about us than it says about him. But he realized that he couldn't go to them for help, and that they couldn't come to him for help. That they didn't have the answer that he needed, and he didn't have the answer that they needed. That his wife, his child who he loved beyond understanding, that they were going to get sick, they were going to get old, they were going to die, and that was unacceptable to him. He couldn't stand that they would suffer so deeply. And he knew that something had to be done. And this point, this realization that something has to be done, that we have to do this, that is the significance of this story. Because, of course, we can say, come on, what are you talking about? There's no way that someone could grow to the age of 28 and never realize that people get sick, get old, and die. That's just impossible. Why do you even tell this story? Everyone knows that that could never really happen. And yet I wonder how many people in this room have realized that we get sick, that we get old, that we die. That a person could come to the age of 28 without realizing that, that's not only possible, that's common. That a person could go through their entire life without realizing that is common. This is how deluded we are. And we claim, I'm not afraid of sickness, I'm not afraid of old age, I'm not afraid of death. But that's just because we haven't faced it. That's just because we're still stuck in complacence. We're still stuck in ignorance. We're still so afraid of this horror that we descend into ignorance again and again to protect ourselves from it, because ignorance is the only way to protect ourselves from it, and ignorance is the most dangerous state we can enter. It does not protect us from it. It maintains it. Ignorance is not a solution, as much as we want it to be. Complacence is not a solution. Apathy is not a solution. We have to face this, and that's what he did. And so he left home. And he studied under the great teachers of his time. And he learned their techniques, their methods. And he mastered those methods. And yet, he didn't find the true resolution of suffering. And so, he entered ascetic practices in which he caused himself extreme pain, extreme suffering. He abused himself, hurt himself, hoping that through that he could overcome suffering, resolve the problem of birth and death. And he brought himself to the very edge of death through his austerities. And yet that didn't work either. That didn't resolve suffering either. And so he considered. He thought, there I was for a long time, trying to use self-indulgence to avoid suffering, hoping that through self-indulgence and avoiding suffering, I could resolve suffering. But that didn't work at all. That completely fell apart. Of course, for most of us, we're still trying that. We haven't realized that it will fall apart, because we haven't realized that people get sick, get old, and die. We're still deluded in that way. But eventually it will stop working. Eventually the delusion will stop working. We'll see through it. And once you've seen through it, you just can't believe in it again. And so he thought then, for a long time, rather than trying to overcome suffering through avoiding it, I tried to overcome suffering through creating it. I tried to cause myself as much pain as possible, thinking that that's how I would overcome suffering. But that didn't work either. And most of us here are in that same place. We also abuse ourselves, thinking, if I just hurt myself enough, typically nowadays we do it emotionally, if I just cause myself enough emotional pain, if I punish myself enough, in that way I'll overcome suffering. Most of us have that experience. When we have a problem, what's our first reaction? Hurt ourselves, insult ourselves, shame ourselves. Try to find a way to cause as much emotional pain as possible, as quickly as possible, thinking, this is how I'll solve the problem. Most of us are stuck in these two extremes. I will avoid suffering and in that way resolve it. A lot of us spend most of the day doing this. I will create pain, create suffering, and in that way resolve it. Most of us spend a lot of the day doing this. But he considered, neither of these worked for me. It didn't work. Is there any other way? Could there be another way? And then he remembered when he was 6 years old, sitting under that rose apple tree, and he entered true concentration, true rapture, and experienced a kind of pleasure that wasn't based on acquisition, that wasn't based on avoidance. And he thought, maybe that's the way. And he had faith in that childlike mind, the mind of a child, and in the simple pleasure that comes from neither pulling nor pushing. And so he sat down under the Bodhi tree, Ficus religiosa. And he attended his breathing and learned how to use his breathing to enter jhana, to enter rapture again. And later, he spoke about this. And he told his students, he said, bhikkhus, when mindfulness of breathing is developed and cultivated, it is of great fruit and great benefit. When mindfulness of breathing is developed and cultivated, it fulfills the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which is to say that we remain mindful of body, feeling, mind, and the path, the dharmas. When the 4 foundations of mindfulness are developed and cultivated, they fulfill the 7 enlightenment factors, which is to say mindfulness, which we already discussed, investigation, which is to say an examination, a careful examination of phenomena, energy, which is to say vigor, enthusiasm, throwing ourselves into this, rapture, which again we've already discussed, tranquility, a deep sense of calm and ease that comes once we've experienced this rapture. Concentration, which is to say that once we've experienced this rapture and it's matured into tranquility, our bodies experience pleasure, and when our bodies experience pleasure, our minds become truly concentrated, which is to say that we can finally enter samadhi. This experience of pleasure, rapture, tranquility, ease in our bodies is of the utmost importance for the way. Not grasping on to sensual pleasure, not grasping on to pain and suffering, but instead entering a state in which a spiritual pleasure fills our bodies, we can relax, and then finally enter samadhi, and then finally the equanimity that comes from samadhi, which purifies our minds. And when the 7 enlightenment factors are developed and cultivated, they fulfill true knowledge and deliverance. True knowledge is directly seeing the truth. True knowledge, knowing, wisdom, true insight, and deliverance, which is to say liberation. And how, bhikkhus, is mindfulness of breathing developed and cultivated so that it is of great fruit and great benefit? Here, a bhikkhu, which is to say a person throwing themselves into the training, gone to the forest or to the root of a tree or to an empty hut, sits down, having folded his or her. The commentary makes it clear that bhikkhu here means anyone who's totally dedicated to the training, willing to change their life for the training. Having folded his legs crosswise, set his body erect, and established mindfulness before him. Ever mindful, he breathes in. Ever mindful, he breathes out. Breathing in long, he understands, I breathe in long. Breathing out long, he understands, I breathe out long. Breathing in short, he understands, I breathe in short. Breathing out short, he understands, I breathe out short. This is all. We sit and we simply notice right now, this is how the breath is going. It's a long breath, it's a short breath. We're just aware of that. We just track that breath after breath. Not more than that, not less than that. He trains us, I shall breathe in experiencing the whole body. I shall breathe out experiencing the whole body. As we breathe, we're aware of our entire body. In this way, our entire mind becomes engaged. When our entire body is engaged, our entire mind is engaged. When our entire mind is engaged, there's nothing else that can distract us. He trains us, I shall breathe in tranquilizing the bodily formation. He trains us, I shall breathe out tranquilizing the bodily formation. We tranquilize, calm, pacify our bodies. Our bodies become calm and easy, light and clear. We use our breath to do this. Of course, we feel this agitation. We sit here and we feel pain, agitation. We feel this terrible conflict within. And we think, oh no, the practice isn't working. This is just like the bodhisattva going out into Kapilavastu and thinking, oh no, this trip isn't working. I don't like it. I don't want to experience this. I want to go back. This is what we become like because we experience a tension, a conflict in our bodies as we sit. But we don't realize that that conflict, that tension, that's making us squirm and try to get away from it, try to avoid it. No. That makes us enter that state of mind, that has always been there. That has been running our lives for decades. It's always been there. The vast majority of human behavior is simply the attempt to avoid that internal conflict. We have this experience of conflict and we don't want to have the experience of conflict, so we're in conflict with conflict. And we live a life based on avoiding it, without seeing that every moment that we're living in order to avoid this internal conflict, we're missing our true purpose in life. We cannot both live in order to avoid this internal conflict and live in order to fulfill our vow. We cannot do both things. Therefore, we sit here and we face that conflict and we learn how to tranquilize it, how to let it go. That's a skill that's needed, and our breath can allow us to do it. He trains us, I shall breathe in experiencing rapture. He trains us, I shall breathe out experiencing rapture. Finally, once we've tranquilized our bodies and we've let go of this terrible, constant conflict that's worked its way into each muscle and each bone and each joint and each pore of our skin, once we've tranquilized that, then finally rapture arises in our bodies. When rapture arises in our bodies, we can experience it with our breath. I shall breathe in experiencing rapture. I shall breathe out experiencing rapture. And then there's an even more subtle kind of happiness. Rapture is still overwhelming, but we can pacify even that. I shall breathe in experiencing pleasure. Pleasure is just a more subtle kind of happiness than rapture. He trains us, I shall breathe out experiencing pleasure. He trains us, I shall breathe in experiencing the mental formation. He trains us, I shall breathe out experiencing the mental formation. The mental formation means that we're using our minds to concentrate. So we're using our minds to concentrate, and we experience how it is that we can use our mind as a tool in order to maintain the path, in order to maintain concentration. We see how that happens. We become better and better at it. And yet we realize that even that is still manipulation. And we realize how it is that we can let go of even that. He trains thus, I shall breathe in, tranquilizing the mental formation. He trains thus, I shall breathe out, tranquilizing the mental formation. That means that this vitakka vichara, this sense of thought-based mental manipulation for the sake of concentration, that can be released. And finally, this pleasure just naturally leads us on the way. And we don't have to manipulate ourselves, which is to say we can let go of the conflict between me and me. For most of us, concentration means that I, who want to concentrate, is fighting against me, who doesn't want to concentrate. I and me are fighting with each other. And we make ourselves concentrate, even though I don't want to concentrate. I want to think about this other thing. Well, you have to concentrate, so you better concentrate, but I don't want to. You can't make me. Well, sure I can. Watch me. No, you can't. Watch me. And we have this constant conflict, which often can last for a long time. But at a certain point, we realize we don't need that conflict anymore. We can concentrate without that conflict because there is no conflict. We've set aside, we've tranquilized body and mind, and at that time, we can enter true concentration. Now, of course, we can use these instructions, and we should use these instructions. It's good to use these instructions. But it's also good for us to understand on a very high level what happened here in the Bodhisattva's career. He started off for a very long time learning about the path. We heard one story about it with the old priest who told him that friendship is the basis of the path. He learned about it. He learned the doctrine. He learned the right way to understand it. This is very important. He then moved on. He was born into this last life, and of course, at this point, he didn't have anyone to learn from anymore because no one had the true doctrine, which only a Buddha can provide. But he had already learned some doctrine, so he couldn't learn a lot of doctrine. But he could go and learn method. He could learn methodology in order to enter states of samadhi. And then having done that, he realized, but it didn't work. Everything I've learned doesn't work. And so then he returned to a completely confused, innocent mind of a child, in which there was simple, pure desperation and a willingness to do whatever needs to be done. This is an indication of what has been described since ancient times, that there are basically 3 levels of training on this path. There's the inferior, the mediocre, and the superior. The inferior is learning doctrine. We learn doctrine. We learn this is how it is, and that's how it is. We learn about the 4 foundations of mindfulness and the 7 enlightenment factors. We do these classes that Daniel is kindly leading. We learn doctrine. We learn the right way to look at things. This is very important, and we should spend a long time on it. This inferior, lowest level of training is very important. Having done that, we can possibly move beyond that. And we learn method. We learn technique, so that we can apply the technique, but we can understand the technique in terms of the doctrine. Applying the technique, we come to certain realizations, but it isn't enough. Eventually, we have to set aside everything, and we enter pure confusion. There's no hope. There's no way forward. There's no way to know what to do. But we must do it. It must be done, but it can't be done. But it must be done. We enter a state of utter desperation, facing this just as it is, understanding it with wisdom. This is this final stage. There's nowhere else to look anymore. We have to have faith in our own deep wisdom. This is the highest level. It's the job, basically, of a teacher to see which level a person is at and teach them at that level. Sometimes we think, I'm at the level where I need a lot of doctrine. Please let me think about this a lot. I say, no, you're not. You have the capacity to enter the highest level. Other times you say, I'm at the highest level. I don't need any doctrine. He says, you better study some doctrine. You need to put this in perspective a little bit. As we move through this, of course, we learn different ways of looking at things. Of course, we learn different ways of doing things. And then ultimately, we come to the point when we ourselves have to realize it beyond any understanding, beyond anything we've acquired. And in fact, even as we move into each meditation period, we can move through these 3 levels. We can start off establishing a certain way of looking at it, remembering, yes, Soryu said this, and that book said that. Okay, well then I'll do it in this way. And then we apply a technique. We apply the technique and apply the technique until eventually it becomes incomprehensible. And we realize we simply have to do what must be done without any knowledge of how. And in this way, we return to a state of deep faith. This faith allows us to have a direct experience of insight. It's this direct experience of insight that informs our lives. So, please, make use of this opportunity. I understand sometimes it's going to be wonderful. Sometimes it's going to be terrible. Sometimes everything's going to be tranquil and calm. Sometimes there's going to be this conflict within, and we want to squirm and get away. But rather than grabbing on to pleasure, rather than grabbing on to pain, rather than pushing away pleasure, rather than pushing away pain, this retreat allows us to stay right here. And in staying right here, every moment becomes the opportunity to establish a certain way of looking at things, to apply a certain technique, and then to notice that we can go beyond that and realize an insight that we never could have imagined, that no one ever could have taught us. And this way, we gain the true confidence that's needed in order to extract ourselves, in order to free ourselves from the injustice of the world, and in fact, live a life that informs the world, that guides the world toward peace. Please, for your own path, for the sake of all living things, take advantage of this opportunity.